The first story America heard was simple, cinematic, and wrong. According to the headlines, Jessica Lynch fought to the last bullet. She was wounded in a blazing ambush, captured after a heroic stand, abused by her captors, and then ripped from enemy hands by U.S. Special Operations Forces in a nighttime raid straight out of Hollywood. Grainy green night vision footage rolled on a loop. Anchors spoke in hushed, reverent tones. The war, barely weeks old, had its hero. None of that was her story. Jessica Lynch never fired a weapon. She was unconscious when she was captured. She was not abused. The hospital she was taken from was not defended. And the rescue that looked like a firefight was conducted in a building Iraqi forces had already abandoned. But by the time the truth surfaced, it didn't matter. The myth had already done its job. This was not just a battlefield incident. It was a case study in how modern wars are sold, how speed beats accuracy, how imagery beats evidence, and how a single young soldier became collateral damage in a war fought as much on television screens as on Iraqi streets. This is the story of Jessica Lynch and the media war that rewrote her life. The war in Iraq did not begin with the first bomb falling on Baghdad. It began months earlier in studios, briefing rooms, and cable news control rooms, where the battle for public perception was already underway. By the spring of 2003, the United States military and the American media were stepping into a conflict shaped by the ghosts of Vietnam and the optics of the Gulf War, determined not to lose the narrative before the fighting even started. After Vietnam, the Pentagon learned a hard lesson. Wars could be lost on television long before they were lost on the battlefield. Body bags, unfiltered reporting, and images of chaos had eroded public trust. By 2003, the solution was control, not censorship, but access. Reporters were embedded directly into combat units, riding along with soldiers, sharing their danger, their exhaustion, and inevitably their perspective. The arrangement produced vivid, immediate coverage and quietly narrowed the frame through which the war would be seen. This was the first major conflict of the 24-hour news cycle. Cable networks did not just report events, they filled every minute between them. Maps lit up, retired generals analyzed arrows and timelines. Anchors speculated in real time. When nothing happened, something still had to be said. Speed mattered more than restraint, and certainly mattered more than doubt. The Pentagon understood this environment well. Public affairs officers fed reporters carefully shaped briefings, often built on partial or preliminary information. Anonymous military sources became a currency of authority. The phrase "according to officials" carried enormous weight, even when those officials were repeating unverified battlefield rumors. In the rush to keep pace with the invasion, skepticism became a luxury few newsrooms felt they could afford. Hero narratives filled the gap between major combat operations. They provided focus, emotion, and clarity in a war that otherwise looked chaotic and confusing. A single face could stand in for thousands of anonymous troops. A single story could suggest purpose, sacrifice, and righteousness. These stories did not need to be false to be useful, but accuracy was often treated as optional, something that could be cleaned up later. Gender played a role as well. The image of a young female soldier, captured behind enemy lines, resonated deeply with an American audience still adjusting to women in combat zones. It carried echoes of older POW stories, wrapped in modern urgency. The emotional pull was immediate, and that pull discouraged careful questioning. The story felt true, so it was treated as true. This was the environment into which the name Jessica Lynch was introduced to the public. Before most Americans knew where Nazaria was, they believed they knew who she was. Her identity was defined not by her own words or actions, but by a narrative assembled at high speed by people who had never met her. Once a story like that takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. Reporters cite one another. Officials reference media reports as confirmation. Corrections, when they come, arrive quietly and late. By the time facts catch up, the audience has already moved on, satisfied that it has witnessed something meaningful. The war in Iraq would go on to expose many failures, strategic, political, and moral, but one of the earliest was informational. Before the dust settled in southern Iraq, a myth had already been constructed, polished, and broadcast worldwide. At the center of it was a private first class who had no idea a second war had just begun, one that would follow her long after the shooting stopped. Before she became a headline, a symbol, or a controversy, Jessica Lynch was a teenager from Palestine, West Virginia. A town small enough that everyone knew everyone else, and opportunities were limited by geography as much as economics. Her life before the Army was not marked by grand ambition or ideological conviction. It was marked by practicality. Lynch grew up in a working-class family where steady employment mattered more than abstract ideals. College was an aspiration, not a certainty. Like many young Americans from rural communities, she saw military service less as a calling and more as a means: tuition assistance, stable pay, and a way out of a narrow set of options. When she enlisted in the U.S. Army, she did not do so seeking combat or heroism. She signed up for a support role, training as a supply clerk. This distinction matters because it would later be erased. Lynch was assigned to the 507th Maintenance Company, a logistics unit responsible for vehicle repair and sustainment. These were not frontline troops. They were not trained or equipped for direct combat. Their job was to keep the Army moving, not to fight through cities. Like many rear echelon units in the early stages of the Iraq invasion, the 507th was rushed forward faster than doctrine normally allowed, stretched thin by speed and poor planning. Her training reflected this reality. Lynch qualified with her weapon, as required, but she was not trained for urban combat, ambush response, or independent maneuver under fire. She was not prepared to clear rooms, fight house to house, or engage enemy forces at close range. None of this was unusual. The Army is built on specialization, and Lynch was trained for the job she was supposed to do. In the later retellings, however, those details vanished. The support soldier became a frontline fighter, the clerk became a gunfighter, the ordinary became extraordinary. By all accounts from those who served with her, Lynch was quiet, well-liked, and unremarkable in the way most soldiers are. She followed orders, she did her job. She worried about the same things everyone else worried about: getting through deployment, going home, and what came next. There was no evidence that she sought attention or imagined herself as anything other than one of the thousands of soldiers moving north through Iraq in March 2003. That ordinariness is precisely why her story resonated so strongly later. The public did not see a hardened warrior. They saw someone who looked like a daughter, a sister, or a neighbor. The gap between who she actually was and who she would be portrayed as was not accidental. It was necessary. A normal soldier could not sustain a myth. A transformed one could. When the convoy rolled out toward Nasiriyah, Jessica Lynch was not stepping into history. She was doing what she had been told to do, trusting that the people above her knew where they were going and what they were doing. What followed was not the result of bravery or cowardice, but of systems failing at multiple levels. Failures that would soon be buried beneath a far more convenient story. In the early hours of March 23, 2003, the 507th Maintenance Company was exhausted, disoriented, and dangerously out of place. After days of continuous movement through southern Iraq, the convoy was already behind schedule and running on little sleep. Navigation systems were unreliable, maps were outdated, communication between units was fragmented. Like many support units pushed forward too quickly during the opening rush of the invasion, the 507th was operating under the assumption that major resistance in the rear areas had already been neutralized. That assumption was wrong. As the convoy approached the city of Nasiriyah, a series of small errors began to compound. A missed turn turned into a wrong route. The wrong route led directly into an urban area still contested by Iraqi forces, including Fedayeen paramilitary fighters who specialized in irregular, close-range attacks. The convoy, made up of lightly armed logistics vehicles, was suddenly exposed in terrain it was never meant to enter. When the shooting started, it was immediate and chaotic. Iraqi fighters opened fire with small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. Vehicles were hit, drivers panicked, some trucks accelerated blindly, others stalled or crashed trying to turn around in narrow streets. There was no coherent defensive formation, no coordinated response, just individuals reacting to incoming fire in an environment they had not been trained to fight in. Several vehicles were disabled almost immediately. Soldiers were killed or wounded as they tried to escape burning trucks. Others were separated from the main group entirely. Command and control collapsed within minutes. During this chaos, Jessica Lynch was riding in a Humvee that crashed after taking fire. The vehicle hit an obstacle at speed and rolled. The injuries she sustained came from that crash, not from a prolonged firefight. She suffered multiple fractures and was rendered unconscious. By the time Iraqi forces reached her position, the fight for her was already over. This detail would later be erased. In the hours and days that followed, fragments of the event began to surface through radio chatter, incomplete reports, and survivor accounts. In that fog of war, rumors filled the gaps. Some soldiers were unaccounted for, others were confirmed killed. The absence of clear information created space for speculation, and speculation moved faster than verification. Lynch was taken by Iraqi civilians and later transferred to a hospital in Nasiriyah. Medical staff treated her injuries, setting broken bones and stabilizing her condition with limited resources. She remained unconscious for portions of this time and had little awareness of where she was or how she had arrived there. Back on the American side, the absence of a body and the lack of confirmed status created a vacuum. Missing in action reports are among the most emotionally charged events in any war, and this one occurred at a moment when the U.S. military and media were both desperate for clarity and reassurance. That vacuum would soon be filled, but not with restraint. The ambush itself was a failure of planning, navigation, and situational awareness. It was not a heroic last stand or a cinematic battle. It was a logistics unit caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, paying the price for systemic overconfidence and haste. Soldiers died not because they lacked courage, but because the system they trusted put them in an impossible situation. Yet that version of events was messy, uncomfortable, and difficult to explain in a soundbite. It offered no clear villains, no triumphant arcs, and no emotional payoffs. What it offered instead was complexity, and complexity does not survive well in a media environment built on speed and simplicity. By the time the first official statements reached the press, the raw reality of Nasiriyah was already being reshaped. The confusion of the ambush would soon be replaced with a cleaner story, one that transformed a crash victim into a combatant and a tragic mistake into an inspiring legend. The truth of what happened in those streets was about to lose a race it never had a chance to win. Wars do not wait for the facts, and neither does the news cycle. In the days following the ambush at Nasiriyah, official information about the fate of the missing soldiers from the 507th Maintenance Company was fragmentary at best. The Pentagon knew there had been deaths, captures, and serious failures, but it did not yet know the full details. What it did have was pressure to reassure the public, pressure to demonstrate progress, and pressure to show that the war was producing heroes, not just casualties. Into that uncertainty stepped anonymous briefings. Unnamed senior officials began speaking to reporters off the record, offering dramatic details that had not been verified. These accounts described a young female soldier who had fought fiercely, emptying her weapon, killing enemy soldiers, and continuing to resist even after being wounded. According to those early leaks, she was captured only after sustaining multiple gunshot wounds and stab injuries. Some reports implied abuse during captivity, others hinted at interrogation and mistreatment. The story had everything a modern media machine could want. It was personal, it was emotional, it was morally simple, and it arrived at exactly the moment the networks needed something to hold on to as the initial shock and awe phase of the invasion gave way to a slower, more confusing ground combat. Within hours, those unverified claims hardened into accepted truth. Cable news anchors repeated them with confidence. Print outlets cited broadcast reports. Broadcast reports cited unnamed military sources. Each repetition added authority without adding evidence. The qualifiers disappeared, reportedly became according to officials, and according to officials became fact. The absence of confirmation was treated not as a warning sign, but as proof that the details were too sensitive to disclose. Gender amplified the effect. The image of a young woman captured behind enemy lines triggered cultural reflexes that went largely unexamined. She was framed as uniquely vulnerable, uniquely courageous, and uniquely symbolic. The story was no longer about a convoy ambush or logistical failure. It was about innocence under attack and heroism under fire. In that framing, complexity was the enemy. Few reporters paused to ask basic questions. How likely was it that a supply clerk would be engaged in a prolonged firefight? Why were there no confirmed casualty reports matching the alleged gun battle? Why did details change slightly from briefing to briefing? These questions were either not asked or brushed aside in the rush to keep the story moving. The person at the center of it all, Jessica Lynch, had no voice in the narrative being built around her. She was unconscious, hospitalized, and entirely unaware that her life was being rewritten in real time. The public did not see a wounded soldier in need of care. They saw a symbol, one carefully shaped to meet emotional demand. The myth also served a strategic purpose. At a moment when images of civilian casualties and stalled advances threatened to complicate public support, the story provided moral clarity. It suggested sacrifice, valor, and purpose. It reassured viewers that American troops were brave, righteous, and under threat, and that they deserved unwavering support. By the time the story reached full saturation, it no longer mattered where it had come from. It existed independently of sources, reinforced by repetition and emotional investment. To question it was to risk appearing cynical, unpatriotic, or cruel. The myth was protected not just by official silence, but by audience expectation. What began as a rumor had become narrative. What began as narrative had become identity. And with that transformation complete, the truth faced an almost impossible task. It would have to fight not just misinformation, but attachment, the deep human tendency to defend the stories we want to believe. The next phase of the saga would provide dramatic visuals, official confirmation, and a carefully staged climax that appeared to validate everything the public had already been told. The myth was no longer fragile. It was ready for its proof. If the story needed confirmation, the rescue provided it, or at least it appeared to. On the night of April 1st, 2003, U.S. Special Operations Forces entered the Saddam Hussein General Hospital in Nasiriyah to recover Jessica Lynch. What the public would later see was a tightly edited sequence of grainy, green night vision footage. Soldiers moving down dark hallways, weapons raised, doors kicked open, shouted commands echoing off concrete walls. It looked dangerous. It looked urgent. It looked like combat. The footage was released almost immediately. News networks aired it repeatedly, often with dramatic music and breathless narration. Anchors spoke of daring raid conducted under fire. Commentators praised the bravery of the rescuers and framed the operation as proof that the earlier stories of fierce resistance and brutal captivity had been true all along. The visuals did the work the words alone could not. But visuals can lie by omission. What was not shown was just as important as what was. Iraqi forces were not guarding the hospital. There was no firefight inside the building. Doctors and nurses later stated that they had tried to return Lynch to U.S. forces earlier, only to be turned away by fighting in the area. By the time the raid occurred, the hospital was effectively undefended. Medical staff did not resist. They assisted. The gunfire heard on the footage did not come from enemy fighters. It came from U.S. troops firing into walls and ceilings to maintain operational momentum and, intentionally or not, dramatic effect. The doors being kicked in led to empty rooms or cooperative hospital staff. The danger suggested by the imagery did not match the reality of the situation on the ground. None of this fit the narrative that had already been sold. The rescue operation itself was not reckless or unnecessary. Recovering a wounded soldier from an unsecured urban area during wartime is a legitimate military objective. The problem was not the mission, it was the way it was presented. The operation was framed as validation of a myth rather than correction of it. Timing mattered. The raid occurred after Lynch's presence at the hospital was already known. It occurred after Iraqi resistance in the area had largely collapsed, and it occurred at a moment when the media narrative surrounding her capture had reached maximum emotional saturation. The footage did not just document the rescue, it completed the story arc that had already been written. In effect, the imagery laundered the earlier falsehoods. Once viewers had seen armed soldiers moving through a hospital at night, the question of whether there had been resistance became irrelevant. The image overpowered the details. Skepticism was replaced with awe. Any later claim that the rescue was uncontested would sound, by comparison, petty or ungrateful. The Pentagon did not immediately correct the record. Officials allowed the impression of danger to stand, even as internal accounts contradicted it. This ambiguity benefited everyone involved, except the person at the center of the story. The military appeared decisive. The media appeared vindicated. The public felt reassured. Jessica Lynch, meanwhile, was moved to safety and began the slow process of recovery, physically unaware that her rescue had been staged as the climax of a story she had never agreed to tell. The raid marked the point of no return. From that moment on, the myth was no longer based solely on anonymous briefings or speculative reporting. It had pictures, it had video, it had something that felt like proof. And in a media ecosystem that prizes images over context, that was enough. The truth was still there, waiting to be heard, but now it would have to compete with something far more powerful than rumor. It would have to compete with a movie everyone thought they had already seen. The first cracks in this story did not come from investigative journalism or official corrections. They came from the person everyone claimed to be speaking for. When Jessica Lynch regained consciousness and began the long process of recovery, she was confronted with a version of her own life that she barely recognized. Newspapers described her as a fearless fighter. Television segments praised her courage under fire. Politicians invoked her name as a symbol of resolve. None of it came from her, and none of it matched what she remembered. When she was finally able to speak publicly, her account was calm, restrained, and devastating to the narrative that had been built around her. She stated plainly that she never fired her weapon. Her rifle had jammed during the chaos of the ambush, and she had no memory of engaging Iraqi forces, as there was no last bullet. The injuries she sustained were the result of the vehicle crash, not gunfire or stab wounds. She lost consciousness during the crash and did not wake until she was already in Iraqi care. She also contradicted claims of abuse. Lynch consistently said she was not beaten, interrogated, or mistreated by Iraqi soldiers. She was handled by civilians and medical staff who, despite limited resources and a collapsing infrastructure, attempted to treat her injuries. Doctors set her broken bones, nurses fed her when they could. These details did not fit the story the public had been told, and that made them uncomfortable. Her testimony before Congress in 2007 was the clearest rejection of the myth. Speaking carefully and without accusation, she said she felt used. She did not accuse the military of lying directly, but she made it clear that the story presented to the American public was false. "I am still confused as to why they chose to lie," she said in a statement that cut through years of patriotic framing with quiet precision. What made her account so powerful was not anger, but restraint. Lynch did not attempt to replace one heroic narrative with another. She did not claim secret acts of courage or downplay her fear. She described herself as she had always been, a soldier doing her job, caught in circumstances she did not control. That honesty came at a cost. Correcting the record meant disappointing people who had wanted to believe the myth. It meant being accused, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, of ingratitude. It meant watching as their clarifications received a fraction of the attention given to the original falsehoods. The truth was treated as a footnote, while the myth remained the headline. The emotional toll was significant. Lynch had spoken about the anxiety and guilt she felt knowing that other soldiers, some of whom died, were overshadowed by a story that was never true. She did not want to be a symbol. She wanted the focus to return to those who did not come home, and to the reality of what happened to the 507th Maintenance Company. In telling her story, Lynch forced an uncomfortable reckoning. If she was telling the truth, and the evidence overwhelmingly supported her, then the institutions that had shaped her narrative had failed in fundamental ways. They had prioritized impact over accuracy, and morale over honesty, and they had done so without her consent. Her voice did not erase the myth overnight, but it did something more important. It exposed the cost of getting the story wrong, not in abstract terms, but in the life of a real person who had survived a war, only to find herself fighting the story told about it. The media war had created a hero. Jessica Lynch was left to clean up the aftermath. Once the truth was on the record, the question was no longer what happened in Nasiriyah. The question was what the people who got it wrong would do next. The answer, for the most part, was very little. As Jessica Lynch's statements contradicted the original reports, some outlets issued quiet corrections. A few ran follow-up pieces acknowledging that earlier claims could not be substantiated. But these revisions arrived without urgency, without prominence, and without the emotional framing that had propelled the original story to national obsession. There were no looping graphics, no somber anchors, no primetime monologues explaining how the public had been misled. The imbalance was stark. Sensational claims were broadcast immediately and repeatedly. Retractions were buried in later segments or printed days later on inside pages. The correction cycle moved at a fraction of the speed of the original error, ensuring that the myth would remain more familiar than the truth. Few journalists publicly reflected on how the story had been mishandled. The reliance on anonymous sources was rarely questioned. The failure to verify basic details was framed as an understandable consequence of wartime fog, rather than a preventable collapse of standards. The phrase "mistakes were made" hovered over the coverage, unaccompanied by accountability. Ratings provided a more powerful incentive to move on. By the time Lynch testified before Congress, the media had already found new stories, new controversies, and new heroes. Revisiting the original reporting offered little upside. Admitting institutional failure threatened credibility, and credibility is the currency of journalism. It was easier to let the story fade than to interrogate how easily it had been distorted. The structural problem ran deeper than individual reporters and networks. The modern media ecosystem rewards speed, emotion, and narrative clarity. Verification slows things down. Ambiguity weakens engagement. A story that complicates a popular myth risks alienating an audience that is already emotionally invested in it. In that environment, accountability becomes optional. The Jessica Lynch story was not an isolated failure. It fit a broader pattern that would repeat itself throughout the Iraq War. Premature claims, dramatic framing, and delayed corrections that never fully caught up. Weapons of mass destruction, mission accomplished, surge success metrics. Each followed the same arc. Bold assertions first, quiet revision later. What made Lynch's case unique was the personal cost. This was not an abstract policy error or misinterpreted intelligence estimate. It was a real person whose identity had been reshaped without her consent. When she corrected the record, she was not treated as a whistleblower or a victim of misinformation. She was treated as an inconvenience. The media's failure to reckon with its role sent a clear message. Myths, once established, are rarely dismantled by the institutions that benefit from them. They are allowed to decay quietly, replaced by newer stories that serve the same structural needs. The public, meanwhile, was left with a distorted memory. Many Americans still believe some version of the original narrative, not because they reject the truth, but because they were never given a reason to revisit it. The correction never competed on equal terms. In the end, the media did not formally apologize to Jessica Lynch. It did not conduct a sustained self-examination. It did not change its incentives. The lessons absorbed were not how to prevent the next failure, but how to survive it. And with that lesson unlearned, the system moved on, ready to do it again. The failure of the media cannot be separated from the institution that fed it. By the time Jessica Lynch's story collapsed under scrutiny, the Department of Defense was already retreating into ambiguity. No official briefing ever fully owned the false narrative. No senior official stood at a podium and explained how such dramatic claims had been allowed to circulate as fact. Instead, responsibility dissolved into a familiar fog of passive language and procedural distance. The Pentagon's public position was careful. Officials emphasized that they never officially confirmed the most sensational details. They noted that early reports came from battlefield confusion and were amplified by the press. This framing was technically accurate and strategically convenient. It allowed the institution to deny authorship of the myth while quietly benefiting from its effects. But information does not move through military channels by accident. The early details about Lynch's supposed resistance and abuse did not emerge spontaneously from reporters. They came from unnamed military sources with access to classified or semi-classified information. Whether those sources believed the claims, embellished them, or knowingly distorted them is still unclear. What is clear is that the system allowed emotionally charged, unverified accounts to escape into the media ecosystem without correction. This was not a failure of censorship, it was a failure of restraint. Modern military information operations walk a narrow line between public affairs and psychological operations. Public affairs are meant to inform domestic audiences accurately. Psychological operations are designed to influence adversaries and, sometimes indirectly, civilian populations. In the early stages of the Iraq War, that line blurred. Stories that boosted morale, demonstrated resolve, or justified sacrifice were allowed to circulate even when their factual basis was weak. The Lynch narrative fit perfectly into that gap. It humanized the war, it personalized the cost, it framed U.S. forces as both vulnerable and heroic, and it did so without requiring detailed discussion of strategy, planning failures, or civilian casualties. Whether intentionally constructed or opportunistically embraced, the story served institutional needs at a critical moment. Internally, there were disagreements. Some officers objected to the way the rescue was portrayed. Medical personnel and intelligence analysts questioned the accuracy of the claims almost immediately. But those objections never reached the public with the same force as the original story. Bureaucracies, especially during wartime, are not built to elevate inconvenient truths. The long-term cost of this approach was credibility. Every time the Pentagon allows a false narrative to stand, it weakens public trust, not just in that story, but in all future communications. When later scandals emerged, critics pointed back to cases like Jessica Lynch as evidence that official statements could not be taken at face value. The short-term benefit of a morale-boosting myth was offset by long-term skepticism. The institution also failed the individual. Jessica Lynch did not ask to become part of an information campaign. She was not consulted, informed, or protected from the consequences of the narrative built around her. When she corrected the record, she did so alone, without the full institutional support that might have mitigated the damage. The Pentagon eventually acknowledged that aspects of the story were inaccurate, but acknowledgement without accountability changes nothing. No formal reforms followed, no clear rules were established to prevent similar narratives from forming in future conflicts. It was how to let a useful story burn itself out quietly once it was no longer needed. And that lesson would shape the wars and the coverage that followed. When the cameras moved on and the headlines faded, Jessica Lynch was left with a problem no training manual had prepared her for: how to live inside a story she never agreed to tell. Her injuries required long-term medical care. Multiple fractures meant months of rehabilitation, surgeries, and chronic pain. Like many wounded veterans, she faced a future shaped by as much by recovery as by memory. But unlike most, she carried an additional burden: the expectation that she should perform gratitude for a narrative she knew was false. Public appearances were awkward and emotionally fraught. Audiences expected a hero speech. What they received was a quiet insistence on honesty. Lynch repeatedly redirected attention away from herself and toward the soldiers who died in the ambush at Nasiriyah, names that rarely appeared in headlines. She expressed discomfort with praise that was based on fiction and frustration that correcting the record felt like an act of defiance. She did not reject heroism because she lacked it. She rejected it because it had been misassigned. In interviews, Lynch emphasized that bravery in war is often unremarkable and collective. It exists in medics treating wounds under fire, in soldiers protecting one another during retreats, in units absorbing losses without recognition. The insistence on elevating her above others felt not just inaccurate, but unjust. Her refusal to play the role written for her came with consequences. She was occasionally portrayed as naive, manipulated, or ungrateful, labels rarely applied to male veterans who challenge official narratives. The same cultural forces that had elevated her now seemed irritated by her unwillingness to perform the expected script. Over time, Lynch stepped back from public life. She pursued education, working with veterans' causes, and focused on recovery rather than recognition. Her advocacy centered on truth, not as an abstract principle, but as a form of protection for future soldiers who might otherwise find themselves similarly rewritten. Her story also altered how POW narratives were handled in later conflicts. While exaggeration and myth-making did not disappear, the backlash from her case made institutions more cautious, if only marginally. The damage had been done, but it had not been invisible. Jessica Lynch survived 2 wars. The first was fought in the streets of Nasiriyah, where planning failures and confusion left her injured and unconscious. The second was fought in studios and briefing rooms, where a young private was transformed into a symbol to meet institutional and emotional needs. The first war broke her body. The second followed her for years. She never asked to be remembered as a legend. What she asked for was simpler and far more difficult, that the truth be allowed to stand on its own, even when it is less exciting, less comforting, and less useful than the story everyone wishes were true. Long after the last correction was printed and the last interview aired, the story of Jessica Lynch remained suspended between truth and memory. For many Americans, the original narrative never fully disappeared. It lingered in headlines, half remembered, in documentaries that recycled early footage without context, in the cultural shorthand of the Iraq War's opening days. That persistence is the real legacy of the media war. Once a story achieves symbolic status, it resists revision. Facts can challenge it, even dismantle it, but they rarely replace it. The emotional imprint remains stronger than the correction. In Lynch's case, the cost of that imbalance was personal. Her name became permanently attached to a myth she spent years trying to undo. A reminder that misinformation does not vanish when the record is set straight. It simply becomes quieter. The broader consequences extend beyond one soldier. The Lynch's narrative helped normalize a style of wartime storytelling that prizes immediacy over accuracy and spectacle over verification. It demonstrated how easily institutions and media can reinforce one another when their incentives align, and how little effort is required to let an error stand once it has served its purpose. This pattern would repeat in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in conflicts yet to come. Each time the public would be asked to believe first and question later. Each time corrections would arrive too slowly to matter. Jessica Lynch's story endures not because it was heroic, but because it was instructive. It revealed how modern wars are fought on parallel fronts, one with weapons and one with narratives, and how casualties are counted in credibility as well as lives. In the end, the most honest version of her story is also the least celebrated. A young soldier injured in a preventable failure, recovered by her fellow troops, and then forced to confront the machinery that turned her survival into propaganda. In every war, there are moments that reveal more than strategy briefings ever could. The story of Jessica Lynch is one of those moments, not because of what happened on the battlefield, but because of what happened afterward. Her case exposed how easily truth can become expendable when institutions, media, and public emotion align. No single actor had to deliberately invent a lie for the outcome to be disastrous. All it took was haste, assumption, and a willingness to let a compelling story run ahead of verified fact. The result was not just a false narrative, but a durable one, resistant to correction and immune to accountability. What makes this uncomfortable is how ordinary the process was. There was no grand conspiracy, no secret memo ordering fabrication. There was only a system optimized for speed, clarity, and emotional payoff, operating exactly as designed. When the story worked, no one rushed to stop it. When it failed, no one rushed to claim responsibility. Jessica Lynch paid the price for that convenience. Her insistence on telling the truth did not bring closure. It brought friction. It forced audiences to confront the gap between what they were told and what actually happened, and many preferred not to look too closely. In that sense, the media war outlasted the shooting war. It shaped memory, not reality, and memory is harder to dislodge. The lesson here is not that heroism is false or that soldiers do not act bravely. It is that heroism cannot be manufactured without cost. When institutions decide that morale, messaging, or ratings matter more than accuracy, someone downstream absorbs the damage. In this case, it was a young private who survived a preventable disaster and then had to survive the story built on top of it. Wars will continue. Stories will continue to be told about them. The only question is whether the next one will be written with more care, or whether truth will once again be treated as expendable once it becomes inconvenient. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.